Hi, I am Andres Sibbles and have the pleasure of serving as your moderator for today's webinar. So on behalf of the USDA Climate Hubs and the Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Network, I'd like to welcome you to the fifth presentation in this series of 11 webinars. The series, as you perhaps know, is focused on grazing land management and soil carbon. And the goal is to provide an update on the knowns and unknowns about the influence of management on soil carbon dynamics in grazing lands of the continental United States. Today's presentation will be followed by a short Q&A session. We'd ask that you please type your questions for the speaker in the Q&A tool. So please don't use the chat tool for that. Use the Q&A tool. And you can do so at any time during or after the presentation. And we plan to conclude today's webinar promptly at 45 minutes past the hour. Immediately following the Q&A session, there will be a short poll. So if you have time to complete a few questions there, we'd appreciate if you could do so. Anyhow, so the title of today's presentation is Challenges and Opportunities to Increase Soil Carbon in Subtropical Grazing Lands. And today's speaker is Dr. Maria Silveira, who is a professor of grassland biogeochemistry at the University of Florida Range Cattle Research and Education Center in Ona, Florida. Dr. Silveira's research is focused on nutrient management, soil and water conservation, and ecosystem services associated with cultivated and native grasslands. Through educational and outreach program, she delivers science-based information to producers, extension faculty, industry professionals, and state regulatory agencies on topics related to nutrient management, pasture fertilization, soil health, and the role of pasture on soil carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas mitigation. Dr. Silveira has authored more than 150 peer-reviewed publications. Her program has attracted over $9 million in grants, and she is a member of several professional societies and currently serves as director of the Archbold University of Florida Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Network site. So with that, welcome, Maria, and we will move on to the presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar. My name is Maria Silveira, and my talk today will be focused on challenges and opportunities to increase soil carbon sequestration in grazing lands, particularly in the subtropical region. I'd like to start my presentation by going over this very brief introduction, which I believe most of you are already aware. So grazing lands, which encompasses both native pastures as well as cultivated pastures, they cover a significant proportion of our global land area. They also account for a significant proportion of our agricultural land area. And if we look at the US, the distribution of grazing lands, most of the grazing lands consisted of native rangelands, and those rangelands are mainly located in the western part of the country, where the weather is very dry, so arid and semi-arid conditions. On the other hand, most of our cultivated pastures are in the eastern part of the country, where climate is a little bit more humid, receive more precipitation, but the proportion of pasture lands in terms of the overall grazing land area is significantly smaller. And this ecosystem sequesters a significant amount of carbon in the soil. So if we look at, for instance, there's some estimates that suggest that if you look at only the 10 centimeters, the top centimeters of grazing land soils, and if we can increase 1% of the amount of carbon sequestered in that 10 centimeter layer, that could be the equivalent of total US agriculture greenhouse gas emissions. So any small change in the carbon associated with grazing lands can have a significant And if we look at most of my presentation will be focused on the southeastern part of the US, so this right-hand corner section of the map. And if you look at these different colors, most of the soils in this region are predominant altisols, spodosols, and lentosols. If you're not a soil scientist, don't really understand what that means, I'm going to explain to you. That means that these soils are usually very acidic, very low nutrient content, so very low natural fertility. They are also very sandy, coarse texture. And because of their texture, they also have very limited nutrient and water holding capacity. What that means in terms of carbon sequestration, they have limited capacity to protect carbon against degradation. So it's very difficult to increase soil carbon in this region. On the other hand, if you look at the climatic characteristics of the US Southeast region, the climate is and humid, which offers great potential for photosynthetic fixation of carbon, so photosynthesis. So we can produce a lot of biomass. However, there's this also very high organic carbon decomposition rates. So there's a very fine balance between there's carbon inputs and decomposition. So there's a lot of, I think I'm not going to mention the benefits of increasing carbon because I think most of you are already aware, but there's some limitations. So why we can not always accomplish that increase in soil carbon. We all understand that's important for many aspects. And I'm going to divide those barriers into two main categories. One is biophysical constraints, which I briefly mentioned in the previous slide, the soil types. And also the second category would be the social and economic barriers to increase soil carbon sequestration. So the biophysical constraints, as I mentioned, soils in the southeastern United States offer very limited protection against degradation. And even if we can accomplish that goal of increasing carbon, that quantifying and documenting those changes can be quite difficult because of the time and space scale. So there's the carbon sequestration is a long-term process, usually takes multiple years to be able to detect those changes, but also there's a lot of spatial variability. So it's very difficult to document the benefits of a particular management practice in terms of carbon sequestration. There's also some other constraints related to climate change, for instance, with the expected increase in temperature, it's going to be more difficult to protect carbon against degradation. Lastly, those social and economic barriers. So until we have very strong financial incentives for producers to adopt management practices that can increase soil carbon sequestration, it will be very difficult to convey that message that they need to adopt those conservation practices. However, there's also some very strong opportunities. One of them, probably the most important one, is the possibility of having co-benefits in terms of production and resilience. So in other words, a lot of the management practices that are intended to increase soil carbon sequestration can also have positive impact on forage production, animal production, and overall ecosystem resilience. Also going beyond the farm boundaries, adoption of some of these practices can also have local and regional environmental societal benefits. So as scientists and land managers, I think there's this very important goal of balance production and conservation. So those pictures on the right-hand side, you see those beautiful wildlife. Those are pictures from pastures in Florida taken by a rancher. So we know that these grazing land ecosystems provide a lot of important ecosystem services to society as a whole. So I think the goal as a scientist is to evaluate and promote those management practices that can maintain that beef cattle ranching a viable industry, but at the same time provide those important ecosystems to society. So I decided to do a little bit of literature review. So I went to the scientific literature. I use Web of Science, which most of you probably know. And I used these keywords, pasture, soil, carbon, and management, just to see how many papers were published related to this topic. And I redid that exercise a few days ago, so my numbers will be a little bit more accurate. And I came up with this 4,400 entries. And if we break down those entries by country, A significant proportion of those studies were developed in the US, followed by Australia and Brazil. Those three countries combined, they represent about 70% of all the studies that have been published in the literature in the past 20 to 30 years. That's the time frame that I did this literature review. However, I work in the Southeast, and I was particularly interested in the Southeast region of the United States. So I drilled down to the Southeast, and I came up with a very low number of studies conducted in this region. So that was a little disturbing. And I decided to, well, let's spend a little bit more time and do a more thorough review of those publications that were focused in the Southeastern United States. And this is a paper that we recently published last year, the end of last year, that we looked at impact of grazing land management on soil carbon responses. And the map on your right-hand side shows the locations where the different studies were conducted. Surprisingly, the numbers didn't increase that much, even when we did spend more time searching the literature. We came up with 27 papers focused on this very important topic of management versus soil carbon responses. The good news is that most of these papers, out of this 27, about 17 demonstrated benefits of what we call in the paper improved management practices. So practices that have the potential to improve both production and carbon accumulation. And on average, those management practices increase carbon sequestration rate by about 1.4 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year. The remaining 10, 11 papers, if I remember the number correctly, but about 35% of the total number of papers show no effect of management on soil carbon. So neutral effect, either because the duration of studies, or the duration of the study, or how carbon was measured for, whatever reason it was, there was no benefit documented in those papers. Interestingly, no paper documented negative impact of management on soil carbon. That doesn't mean that it can not happen. Of course, we know that mismanagement can have a negative impact on soil organic carbon, but for this particular region, the Southeast United States, we didn't come across any study that documented negative impact. So when we look at the range, the highest sequestration potential versus the lowest, the highest were usually associated with the conversion of cropland to pasture land, so marginal lands that have very low initial soil carbon levels that had a greater potential to increase carbon once they were converted to pasture land. The lowest potential was associated with overseeding legume into a grass pasture. So there's a number of reasons why that happened, but one of the reasons is grass species are very productive. Their photosynthetic capacity is very high, so overseeding a legume not always results in the benefit that we sometimes see in other regions. So a few of the conclusions from the synthesis was that, well, first of all, there's not enough papers in the literature. 27 is a pretty limited number of papers. Not only that, but there was also a considerable lack of uniformity on how carbon responses were measured. So either the depth, the analytical methods, there's a lot of variability. Very difficult to synthesize that information. Also, another important piece of information, even though we were restricting our search to the Southeast United States, the direction and magnitude of soil carbon responses vary significantly. One of the main factors was duration and intensity of these practices. So it depends on when you say, for instance, a stocking method. There's a number of factors that can influence whether rotational versus continuous stocking is a better option. So there's a lot of variability in that regards as well. So the final conclusion of this paper that we need more coordinated long-term field research to understand and predict carbon responses to management. And that takes me as a segue to the next topic that I would like to cover in this webinar, which is the Long-Term Agro-Ecosystem Research Network. We also refer as LTAR. So we represent one of the sites here with the red circle, but there are other 18 sites throughout the entire United States. A number of the sites are consisted of grazing land sites. So we're evaluating the impact of management practices on both the productivity as well as the environmental footprint and the social and economic component associated with these practices. So this network was established about 10 years ago, and the goal is, as I mentioned, is to increase egg production. Specifically about our LTAR project in Florida, we have a couple different experiments associated with this LTAR project, and I'm going to be covering very briefly a few of them. This one, we're evaluating the impact of prescribed fire on ecosystem carbon responses, and we're using the native rangelands as our study site. The reason for that is that this is, you see the pictures, fire is used by rangers as a means to manipulate vegetation. So the vegetation in this native ecosystems consists of this shrub species that we call saw palmetto. So the goal is to control some of the growth of the saw palmetto and stimulate the growth of native grasses, which are more desirable for livestock than the saw palmetto. So we use fire to manipulate the vegetation. I'm not going to have time to talk about this, but another component of this project, we are looking at use of virtual fence to evaluate whether rotational stock versus continuous stocking would have any benefit or trade-off associated with ecosystem carbon balance as well as the production. So for the sake of today's presentation, I'll be focusing on our eddy covariance data, which basically a technique that measures ecosystem level carbon fluxes. And so we impose different fire regimes, fire frequency, and those fire events usually occur for us in Florida, usually occur during the winter months, so January through March. And this is, and we measure a number of different metrics. One of them is vegetation recovery. So these pictures represent the saw palmetto, that shrub species, days after fire. So this is the day, top picture shows saw palmetto right after fire. 5 days, just a few days after fire, if you go back to the field, you see the leaves sprouting, you see a lot of green. And 18 days afterwards, you see a lot of new green tissue growing. So yeah, we had quite a bit of rainfall between the fire and the 2 weeks after fire, but still, if you pay close attention, you can almost see the plants growing. So they recover very quickly after fire because fires occurs naturally in this environment. So these are fire persistent species. And like I said, we use the eddy covariance technique to evaluate this ecosystem carbon balance. And the paper that I'm using the data from was published in 2021. Dr. Rosabel Bracho, who is a faculty at UF, was the main author. So what we did, we used the eddy covariance to quantify gross primary production. Is basically how much carbon is sequestered via photosynthesis and how much carbon was emitted back to the atmosphere via ecosystem respiration. So the important data in this picture, in this table, that I would like to emphasize here is this net ecosystem production. So the difference between carbon uptake and carbon losses. And the negative values mean that the ecosystem acts as a carbon sink. So you look at those years, 2016, 2017, 18, 19. By the way, 19 is the year that we imposed fire. Ecosystem was a significant carbon sink, sequestering on average here, if we average all 4 years, about 322 grams of carbon per square meter per year. So that's about 3 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year. Significant carbon sink. And there's not much variability even the year that we impose fire. In fact, the gross primary production increased after fire because fire stimulates nutrient cycling. There's a lot of growth a couple months after fire. And like I showed in the previous picture, the vegetation is well adapted to fire and they fully recover their photosynthetic capacity 60 days after fire. So it's a very fast recovery. We also look at some of the below ground responses. So, and in order to do that, we also measure above ground carbon pools. So for instance, this is another paper that was published in 2023. We looked at the above ground carbon pools before and after fire. And of course, as the picture illustrates, there's a significant amount of carbon that's lost during the fire due to combustion. But when we look at the below ground responses, and here what I'm showing is soil carbon stocks, soil nitrogen stocks, and soil peat stocks. There was no significant effect of fire on soil carbon stocks. And there's a number of reasons for that. And I will briefly mention a few. Fire, when we measure the temperature, fire temperature, fire only increased temperature in the surface. When you look at the 5 centimeters, we had sensors at 5, 10 centimeters, there was not a change in soil temperature. So even from the microbial community responses, we didn't detect any change in microbial composition or activity after fire. That reflects why, that's one of the reasons why we were not detecting changes in soil carbon stocks as affected by prescribed fire. Another study, we looked at what we're calling management intensification. What that means is the conversion of these native rangelands, which are very diverse in terms of plant composition, a very diverse ecosystem, compared to monoculture. So a grass, C4, warm season grass dominated pasture. What happens in terms of soil carbon responses when you convert a native rangeland into a cultivated pasture? We also had what we call intermediate intensification, which was a silvopasture system. So the same type of grass, but we also have trees growing along with the grass. I'm not going to have time to show all the details. The previous slide shows some of the publications that came out of this work. There were 2 students, PhD students, that were, this was the main topic of their dissertation. But what I want to show you here is that the impact of this land use conversion in terms of soil carbon and soil nitrogen stocks. When you look at, and this is soil depth up to 1 meter as a function of soil organic carbon stocks. When you look at the most intensive managed systems, the cultivated pasture and the silvopasture, they had much greater carbon stocks compared to the native rangeland. Same with nitrogen. So from the purely carbon sequestration perspective, yeah, that was very positive. We converted, we introduced species that are much more productive, the warm season grass much more productive, and that reflect into the carbon stocks. So there was more carbon accumulation. And by using stable isotope technique, we were also able to trace where the carbon was coming from, and a significant proportion of the carbon, even in the deeper soil layers, was coming from the grass species. So a lot of benefits associated with that. However, when you look at the pools that the carbon was accumulating, and I understand there's some limitations, but I'm using particulate organic carbon as a proxy or as a metric to illustrate lay biocarbon. So a lot of the carbon accumulation in the cultivated pasture occur in that particulate carbon pool. Not much carbon associated with the mineral fraction, which is supposed to be more stable, less susceptible to decomposition. So what that means is that, but yes, you increase carbon stocks as you increase this intensification by converting this native into a cultivated pasture. However, the forms that the carbon is accumulating can be highly susceptible to decomposition again. So in terms of, if we had a disturbance, physical disturbance caused by mismanagement, overgrazing, those benefits could very easily revert back to the original conditions. We also use the eddy covariance technique to look at the ecosystem carbon. So the data that I showed was the soil carbon responses, but we also look at the ecosystem carbon balance. And this top picture here, the top graphic here, the gray bar represent the cultivated pasture, the Bahia grass pastures, and the darker represent the native rangeland. And this is the top figure here is the GPP, gross primary production, so amount of photosynthesis. You see this very clear seasonal pattern in terms of GPP or production. So these are warm season grass species. Usually during the winter months, they go dormant. They don't produce much. You see that the native rangelands production keeps relatively much more stable than the cultivated pasture. When you look at the ecosystem respiration, they were both very strong seasonal signal. So the summer months correspond to the months where we have the greater emissions. But more importantly, when we look at this, the comparison, the balance, so the difference between GPP and ecosystem respiration, both systems were strong carbon sinks again. So you look at this first line in this table, and by the way, I didn't mention this is unpublished data. Dr. Bracho is working on the publication right now. But when you look at this comparison between native rangelands and pasture over years, you see that both ecosystems were strong carbon sinks. More so the cultivated pasture than the rangeland. You see the numbers are much stronger than for the cultivated pasture versus the rangeland. One thing that is interesting to see is note the 2022. You see that NEP for the pasture decreased quite considerably in 2022, while the native rangeland remained very similar. The reason for that drop in the the NEP and the GPP in the cultivated pasture was an extreme weather event that we experienced in 2022. So just one of my few last slides here, just want to show you what Hurricane Ian caused in 2022. So this is the pattern of Hurricane Ian in 2022. We're located right in the center of this, the path. And this is my lab after Hurricane Ian, so considerable destruction. It brought a lot of flooding damage, and those pastures, both the native and the cultivated pastures, were underwater for a significant period of time. To me, the interesting aspect was that despite that extreme weather event, both ecosystems were extremely resilient. And despite this extreme weather event, they continue to be a carbon sink even the months following Hurricane Ian. So just as some final remarks here, as I mentioned, there's some challenges associated with increasing soil carbon in grazing lands in the southeastern United States, but there's also some potential co-benefits in terms of environmental and production. But I think that if we want to convey that message to ranchers, the focus needs to be on production. We need to relay that positive impact of a management in terms of forage or animal productivity. If you want those practices to be implemented on the ground, then there has to be a financial component associated with the benefits. And as I mentioned, for this to happen, we need to have long-term coordinated research to fully evaluate whether those practices can have benefits and what are the trade-offs. A lot of those practices, they're called, there are different names. I'm using soil carbon enhancing practice or climate smart. There's different names to refer to conservation practices. Sometimes there's a lot of barriers, and when we're trying to implement some of those practices, can be very difficult for a number of biophysical and social and economic barriers. So we need to continue to incentivize voluntary programs for ranchers to adopt management practices that can increase soil carbon sequestration. So with that, I would like to acknowledge my team. So all the work that I share with you today reflect an effort from a number of individuals, including our partners at UF, Dr. Roswell Brach, a number of students, postdocs, and staff that were trained under this project, and also our counterpartners, Archibald Biological Station. They are our counterpart in the LTAR network. So picture Dr. Betsy Boughton, Dr. Hillary, and a number of other collaborators from Archibald that are were actively engaged and co-producing science. With that, for any reason I don't have a chance to answer to your questions, please feel free to email me. I'll try my best to answer questions at any time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Maria. We have a number of questions coming in, and some of them are related to the first part of your presentation, to the lit review. And so if it's okay with you, we'll start there, and then, we'll move on to the other questions. So excellent. So the first one we have up here is, how can we improve or standardize the methodology to address the effect of grazing management on soil carbon sequestration?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I guess it's one of the difficulty in standardizing is that people have different research interests. So if you're conducting a short-term study, you may not be focusing on the deep soil carbon because you know that you don't expect that deep soil carbon to change in the short term. What are we trying to do in this paper is there's a appendix section that described how the very detailed information. It was actually difficult to summarize in a table the different soil depths and the different ways that the studies conduct that soil carbon assessment. But I think it will be quite unrealistic to come up with a standardized method because soils are different. The research goals can be different. So in order to overcome that, the approach we used was just simply describe how the different papers conduct their research. And there were not, luckily or not luckily, there were not many. In our case, it was only 27. That was quite a bit of surprise for us because Southeast is where most of the cultivated pastures are located in the United States, and I was expecting a much larger number of peer-reviewed papers, but unfortunately, that was not the case.
Thank you, Maria. There's a related question here about how in your literature review, how did you account for things such as soil depth, length of study, lab methodology for determining carbon, etc., when drawing conclusions from your review of the literature?
So what we were trying to accomplish with that paper was what management practices have been studied and to what extent they can actually change carbon in the soil in the southeastern United States. So we pretty much included anything. Well, we come up with 27. I think if we were to be a little bit more add another criteria, we'll end up with even less papers. So we included everything that reported soil carbon, regardless of the depth, and so the way that we use, if the authors reported a positive impact, that's how we consider the paper that management practice was having a positive impact, and that's how we calculate the sequestration rates. But it was an average across different soil depths and different study durations. Most of the studies were, I can't remember the exact number, but most of the studies had at least 5 years. There was, and one of my papers that are included in the literature review was a 2-year study. So I think probably mine was that 2-year study was the shortest in terms of duration.
Thank you, Maria. There's another question here related to soil depth, and it goes: have you seen in the papers reviewed that soil depth measures as shallow, so less than 10 inches or 25 centimeters? As grazing management improves with deeper diverse root systems, might improvements in carbon be expected?
Yes, it does. And then again, it depends on the duration of the study. For instance, that data that I showed, that I was comparing the conversion of native rangelands to improved pastures. When you look at, and there was a carbon and nitrogen, different soil depths, that response that we saw on the surface was consistent in the deeper soil layers. So in other words, by introducing warm season grasses that are more productive than the native vegetation, we increase soil carbon not only in the top layers, but also in the deeper layers. And so not only the amount, but also when you look at the carbon delta C13, so the composition of the carbon, the most of the carbon that was accumulated in the deeper layers came from the grass versus the native vegetation. So yes, it is possible. It just takes time. In that case, they study those different pastures have been under the same management for over 20 years. So it took 20 years to get to that point where we were able to detect changes in the deep soil carbon.
Thank you. There's a question here about your fire treatments, and it asks whether you measured emission during the prescribed fire, and if so, were the emissions emitted offset by the amount of carbon sequestered as a result of the prescribed fire?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Yes, we measured the proportion of above ground nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus that was lost during the combustion. And pretty much it was, of course, especially for carbon and nitrogen, a significant proportion of those nutrients were lost during fire. We also measure how much was deposited via as ash, but it still was not. And then right after fire, there was a significant increase in the photosynthesis. So nutrients were added to the soil after fire that stimulate plant production. And that kind of compensated over the course of the year, that kind of compensate for the carbon that was lost during combustion. Yes. So there's a paper that we look at the mass balance. We emitted a lot of carbon to the atmosphere from the above ground vegetation. So nothing in the soil. We really didn't detect any change in the soil. But because of that, also fire also stimulate plant growth that compensate the next. In fact, the plants fully recovered their photosynthetic capacity about 2 months after fire. So it was a very quick recovery. And but we didn't see any change in the soil because when you look at the soil temperature, the fire only increased soil temperature in the very top 2.5 centimeters. So there's not much increase in soil temperature below that, and that's why we didn't see. We look at a soil microbial response, a number of different soil responses, and we didn't detect any impact of fire, which was also surprising to me. I would expect that maybe some microbial communities would be promoted or eliminated during fire, but that didn't really occur.
Thank you. There's a question about livestock herbivory here. So what was the fraction of biomass removed by livestock, and was that removed from your net ecosystem production values?
So I guess it depends on which system we're talking about. So the grazing strategy is different in the native versus the cultivated pasture. The cultivated pasture is grazed pretty much year round. The livestock they are supplemented during the winter months when the grass growth is reduced. But in the native rangeland, it's only that ecosystem is only utilized during the winter months. So the animals graze the native for about 3 to 4 months each year during the winter months. So it's usually used in conjunction with the cultivated pasture. Landowner in Florida will use the cultivated pasture, bahia grass, or the warm season grass pasture as a main forage source in the summer months. And when the plants go dormant, they move the animals to the native vegetation. So the proportion will be different depending on which system we're talking about. And also the grazing stocking rate is different. The grazing duration, of course, is different. But yeah, we account for that in our calculations.
Thank you. There's a question about the bahia grass here. And for the research about intensively managed pastures, are the bahia grass pastures fertilized? If not, why do they have so much more nitrogen, is the question.
Yeah, I try to be careful when I say intensively managed, because intensity can be quite for a relative comparison with a native, that's an intensively managed. But if you compare it to other systems, that can be minimally managed. So relative comparison with the native, yes, the bahia grass is more intensively managed because it's rotationally grazed, the grazing duration is greater, and it also receives nitrogen. You're correct. It receives, those pastures usually receive annual application nitrogen, about 50 to 60 pounds of nitrogen to the acre per year, versus the native, which is never fertilized. I'm not sure if that was the question, but yeah, that also reflects why there's more nitrogen in the improved pasture, because those pastures receive annual application of nitrogen.
Yes, I think that is what was being asked. And so there's another question about asking if you could comment or speculate about potential for soil carbon increases in response to grazing management on introduced cool season species pastures on fine textured soil, northwest of coastal plain in the southeast United States.
I suspect, and this is just my perception. I have no data to back up what I'm going to say. So Florida, we have very coarse texture soils. Even as a soil scientist, I never seen any soils like what we have in Florida. So just to give an idea, it's 99% sand. There's very little clay to protect carbon against degradation. So anything that you put above ground pretty much decomposes. So the combination of the coarse texture soils and our climatic conditions extremely favorable to decomposition. So unless usually the management practices that have greater potential to increase soil carbon are the ones that increase carbon input, because the composition is so high, you have to balance or add more carbon. That's what is being decomposed every year. So that's why some of the management practices that are perceived as being positive in some environments don't work really well. And legume is one example, produce much less dry matter than the grass, has some issues with competing with the grass and longevity. So those are some of the issues that lead to failure. So now I imagine that in soils that have greater potential to protect carbon, so fine texture soils, in environments where a cool season might produce better, that might be a different story. But this is just I'm speculating. I don't think that the reason why we fail, and we had studies where we had overseed the summer pasture with cool season legumes, but in fact that the physical disturbance of the soil caused so much, actually had negative impact on the soil carbon balance.
Thank you, Maria. We have a couple of questions about the effective time. And so this one goes, how long do the changes in land use, such as conversion from cropland to pasture, take to reach a new soil carbon equilibrium?
Because the soils in Florida have such a low buffering capacity, so it doesn't take much to change either direction. For us, things happen relatively faster than in other environments. In fact, I have trouble when I'm published some of my data. After 2 years, if we have extreme treatments, we can change that carbon both ways. But that's very unique to the system that, again, extremely sand with a warm and wet climate. I suspect in other environments will take much longer. So for us, if we evaluate mismanagement over grazing, something like that, yeah, we can definitely see impact on soil carbon in a matter of 2 years. But that's very unique to our conditions because it's subtropical and because of our soil type.
Thank you. Here's another question about time, and it asks whether there has been long-term monitoring of soil carbon stocks more than 10 years at Archbold or any other of your field sites, and are there any publications you could reference from those?
So yeah, unfortunately, we don't have. We have some limited data. So the study where we looked at the conversion of native to improved pasture, we didn't have the sites were not designed to address this question. So 30 years ago, people were not doing that because they want to study carbon. For a number of reasons, they converted some of the native into cultivated pastures. So we are using the native as the baseline. We don't have the initial soil samples. That's one of the limitations in this experimental design. And unfortunately, we don't have archive samples to go back 30 years ago to see what happened. So we're using the native as a baseline. And that's the approach we're using because, again, long-term studies were not really, with the LTAR, we're trying to do that, but we can't go back 20 years and looked at the initial soil samples, unfortunately.
Thank you, Maria. We probably have enough time for one more question, and so there will be some questions that will go unanswered today, but we will try to get those answers to you before long. And there are some more questions about fire, and this one asks if during the prescribed fire experiments whether you tracked plant nitrogen year by year, and if so, did the nitrogen content decline during the experiment?
Yes, so the nitrogen in the plant is one of the indicators of the forage nutritive value to livestock. So yes, we track that because we're interested in whether fire can improve the nutritive value of this forage species, and it actually did. But it did for a short period of time, right after fire, a couple months after fire, the year after fire. But second year after fire, those results are pretty much gone. Interestingly, we've been imposing this different fire management strategy, which I guess I didn't fully explain in the presentation, but so we were burning every 4 years, every 2 years, and also burning with in conjunction with mechanical control of the shrub species. Interestingly, we are in the second cycle of this study. haven't seen much response in terms of plant manipulation. So those systems evolved under fire. So now the past 8 years, we're trying to use fire to manipulate vegetation. Vegetation is being pretty stubborn. Yeah, we see some modest reduction in the shrub species, but not to the extent that we were originally expecting. So that means that we need more years of data to see how that vegetation will continue to respond.
Thank you so much, Maria, for today's presentation and for answering these questions. We appreciate it. And
thank you.
And yeah, thank you. And thanks to everybody who jumped on today for attending today's webinar. Please plan to join us for the next one, scheduled to happen on October the 7th. And the title of that webinar will be Greenhouse Grass Fluxes in Grazing Systems, Typical of the Midwest and Implications for Beef Producers, by Dr. Galen Erickson from the University of Nebraska. So we hope to see you then, and note that there is a poll with some questions. If you have time and would care to answer them, we'd appreciate that. And we will see you next time on October the 7th. Thank you.